Welcome to the Stoic Responder Podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Healy. As a special agent who spent more than 15 years conducting large-scale fraud, money laundering, and public corruption investigations, Stoic philosophy provided a mindset edge that became the foundation of my professional success. My mission today is to share those same ancient mindset lessons with you so that you can turn obstacles into opportunities and adversity into advantage. Time to muster up. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Stoic Responder Podcast. This is episode 97. The noblest victories. We started out the week talking about Viktor Frankl. I'm going to end the week talking about Viktor Frankl and some other great stories that are kind of similar, where individuals use some of these concepts of Stoicism in their lives in incredible ways with incredible success. And I don't know if I talk about this, but the way I kind of structure this podcast is I take one lesson from each of the cardinal virtues every week. So I have 4 episodes a week because there's 4 cardinal virtues. There's temperance, there's justice, there's wisdom, there's courage. And so each lesson, I don't like say, hey, this is our lesson on courage very often, but each lesson is typically based in one of each of those in the course of a week. So you get kind of a well-rounded presentation of how the Stoics viewed the 4 cardinal virtues and how they approached each of them. And I think probably the best way to talk about the quote that I'm going to give you today and talk about the individuals I'm talking about today is to talk about this idea of self-discipline, this idea of temperance is the virtue, but it really means self-discipline. It really means self-control is really how it's spoken about by the Stoics. So before I get into it, let me tell you about our 2 favorite organizations that I love to give shout outs to. Number 1 is the Overwatch Collective, which is a nonprofit and podcast funding therapy sessions and supporting mental health initiatives for our first responders, our veterans, and their families. Their motto is one more is one less, and that means one more individual that we provide these life-saving services to is one less potential statistic. You can check them out and support their efforts at theoverwatchcollective.com. I also love to give a shout out to Blue Badge Coffee Company because they have a similar mission. In addition to providing customers with the absolute best, highest quality premium coffee that their money can buy, Blue Badge takes a portion of each and every sale and donates it to law enforcement agencies across our great nation to assist them in funding or maintaining peer support and wellness programs for their officers. You can check them out at bluebadgecoffee.com. Okay, as I said, starting out with a quote from Plato, "For a man to conquer himself is the first and noblest of all victories." All right, so we've seen this quote kind of in a couple of different ways. Publius says that you should rule a mighty empire, first rule yourself. I believe Epictetus has a similar quote where it's something along those lines. This is Plato's version of it. This is a very Stoic concept. Plato, of course, predates the Stoics, but this is a very Stoic concept that exists, and it really gets to the core of what self-discipline is within Stoic philosophy. What it really is it's about ruling over your own desires, ruling over your own, your own passions, ruling over your own emotions, ruling over yourself, and really being internally focused and internally controlling, right? Recognizing and understanding what it is that you control, your actions, your attitudes, your efforts, your reactions, your emotions. Those are all within your control, and that you want to conquer yourself. That is the noblest of all victories. To beat that is the noblest of all victories. Just ask anybody who's ever struggled with dependency, who's ever struggled with addiction, who's ever struggled with, any sort of, issue of, self-harm, things of those nature, right? It really comes down to self-discipline and self-control over your own basest and worst instincts. And that's really what they're advocating for here. So as I said, we started talking about Viktor Frankl early in the week. Viktor Frankl, of course, survived. He was the Austrian logotherapist. What logotherapy is the school of therapy that he developed. So he's the Austrian professor and therapist and doctor who created this logotherapy after surviving 3 years in a Nazi concentration camp. Along the way, he loses his father, his brother, his mother, his wife to starvation, to pneumonia, to the gas chambers. That's just a horrible story. If you read Man's Search for Meaning, you get a little bit of that, and you get a lot, as we talked about in the first episode this week, about how he overcame that and how he found meaning and purpose in his life despite the horror that he was facing in these external circumstances that he was placed in, right? That was outside of his ability to control. He recognized and realized what he did control and different ways to focus inwardly on what he controlled. Now, There's some other great stories that come out of World War II, that come out of wartime in general. We can look at Louis Zamperini, the Olympic runner who survived a plane crash in the South Pacific and then survived 47 days at sea in a life raft before being picked up by a Japanese cutter and placed in a prisoner of war camp where he was tortured and beaten for more than 2 years by a sadistic guard. You can read the book Unbroken and learn about his struggle. You can watch the movie. It's a great movie. The book is obviously, a really faithful telling of his time as a young man, his time as an Olympic runner, his time training for the Olympics, and it goes deeper into detail about all of that. And then it talks about his journey of faith after the war, his struggle with alcoholism, his journey of faith. And the whole book is really about this idea of disciplining oneself. He disciplined himself to survive, torture, or to survive 47 days at sea, to survive, the boredom and the struggle with just getting enough food and water to survive. He survived, obviously a Japanese prison camp, just brutal conditions where others were beaten and tortured and killed, and had to overcome this, this terrible guard who was just, beating him down. He had to overcome all of that. He had to overcome, before even being in the military, before World War II, obviously he was an Olympic runner. The self-discipline it took to become an Olympian, to become an athlete of that caliber. It talks a lot about that as a young man growing up in Torrance, California. All of this comes down to that cardinal virtue of self-discipline, of getting within yourself and recognizing what you control and not allowing external circumstances to beat you down. We've talked about James Stockdale on this podcast, the vice admiral, the Navy pilot who was shot down over North Vietnam. He was captured. He's confined to the Hanoi Hilton for 7 excruciating years, the highest ranking officer there. And so they figure if they torture him and if they can break him and get him to talk and get him to give details, then everyone below him in the chain of command will do the same. So he's at this high level. He's on a pedestal among his men. He realizes he has to talk about honor culture, talk about what we talked about in the second episode this week. He really has to lean into that honor culture, that recognizing and understanding that he has to hold himself to the highest possible standard for the sake of the men below him. Right. And so he leans into some of these same ideas of first conquering himself, and that's what Zamperini did. He first conquered himself. That's what Stockdale did. He first conquered himself. Probably another great example, a modern example, Aaron Ralston. If you've ever seen the movie, I think it's called like 121 hours or 124 hours, something like that. But it stars James Franco. And it's this guy, Aaron Ralston. James Franco is playing the part of this real life guy, Aaron Ralston, who goes hiking in Blue John Canyon in Utah all by himself. And while he's hiking, he's in the canyon, he becomes trapped when an 800-pound boulder shifts and pins his arm against the wall. He's stuck there all of a sudden. No one around, no cell phone service. In the middle of this, like 2005 or whenever it was. He survives alone for 5 excruciating days trying to get help. He ends up having to drink his own urine to survive. Just this incredible like story of survival, trying to get his arm out, Finally, he decides the only way I'm going to survive this is if I do the unthinkable. He intentionally breaks his own forearm so that he can amputate his arm with a dull pocket knife that he has on him. And that's what allows him to break free from this 800-pound boulder. This isn't it though, because where he's pinned, he's on kind of an elevated area. He has to get down to ground level. He has to rappel 65 feet down the face of this mountain or hill with a severed arm, just to get down to the ground level. And then he's got to hike another 7 miles to get to safety, where he finally gets somebody to, pick him up and take him for medical help. This is a guy who, simply just, if he had just, told his family where he was going or given anybody a heads up, he would have been found and rescued. But nobody knew where he was. They didn't even know where to begin to look. And he realized that the only way that he was going to survive was by doing something that most of us would consider completely unthinkable: breaking your own forearm and then amputating it with a dull pocket knife. I cannot even imagine the resilience, the mental fortitude, the self-discipline it would take to get yourself to that point, to talk yourself into it, to recognize the circumstances, not talk yourself out of it, actually go through with it. Excruciating cut by excruciating cut. Just an incredible survival story. Again, a book and a movie. Would highly encourage you to check it out, because these sorts of things, when we read Man's Search for Meaning, when we read James Stockdale's writings about his time in the Hanoi Hilton. Again, there's a book about that. When we read Unbroken about Louis Zamperini and his time as a Japanese prisoner of war, his time adrift at sea for 47 days, his time training for the Olympics, when we read about Aaron Ralston and his time stuck, that 5 days trapped by this boulder, stuck and sure he's going to die, he's never going to be found, debating with himself what the best course of action is, how much longer he can hold out before he has to do this thing to actually get himself to safety. When we read about those things, we can't help ourselves but recognize and understand that there's something within these men that was above and beyond what we typically have, what we typically can muster on a daily basis. And we're impressed by it. Because how simple would it have been for any of these men to just give up? How much easier would surrender have been than to endure the horrors and loss for one more minute, for any of them, for one more hour, for one more day? And yet none of them did. They endured, they survived, they continued, all because they were able to conquer themselves. You see, these men offer proof of the wisdom of Plato's words, of Publius's words, of Epictetus's words. Yes, the enemy is out there, whether it's on the battlefield or in the arena, whatever it is, whether it's on the job, on the shift, on duty, the enemy is out there. There is somebody putting external pressures on us who is going to put us in terrible situations. But the greatest victories that are ever going to come to us aren't going to come from overcoming that enemy. It's going to come from overcoming ourselves, from first confronting and defeating the limitations of our own hearts and our own minds. And that's what each of those men did. They overcame the limitations that we set for ourselves. To conquer oneself is to transcend the limitations of ego, of desire, of fear, of addiction, and obtain a state of inner harmony and integrity. And that, as Plato said, is indeed the noblest of all victories. We cannot accomplish any of these great things that these great men accomplished without first recognizing that we have to conquer ourselves. We have to conquer and transcend our own limitations in order to survive like that. So hopefully none of you end up trapped by an 800-pound boulder. Hopefully none of you end up in a Japanese prisoner of war camp or the Hanoi Hilton, or God forbid, this should ever happen again, but a concentration camp. But recognize and understand that you have everything within you that these men had and have in some cases. You have that. You have but simply to conquer yourself. All right. Let me leave you with the journal prompt, get you out of here for the week. Who is my greatest competition and how can I conquer him? Now, your answer to this is that your greatest competition is yourself, but how can you conquer yourself? That's a harder question. What is it that you're doing today that you shouldn't be doing, that if you were able to conquer that would be one step towards conquering yourself? It can be something as simple as, look, I chewed tobacco for years, as a lot of police do. You're late night on surveillance, or you're, driving a long distance or whatever. It was a habit I picked up early in my career. It's a habit I had in college that I gave up, but then I picked it back up again in my career. And it was a hard habit to break. And I quit cold turkey when I did. And I looked at it as a challenge to conquer myself. Now it's been probably, it's been 6 or 7 years since I've touched chewing tobacco. And I just gave it up, quit cold turkey. And the reason being was, and believe me, there are times when I drive past a convenience store and, think, just one can of Skull. I got to mow the lawn this week and just one can of Skull. But I know where that leads, right? And so the mental fortitude it took to quit a habit that I knew wasn't good for me, that wasn't doing me any favors, to give it up cold turkey, I consider a great accomplishment. I consider that conquering myself, committing to self-discipline, right? It could be the same about losing weight. It could be the same about giving up some habit that you know is not good for you, giving up drink, giving up drugs, giving up recreational whatever, giving up any number of things is how you conquer yourself. You overcome those things that tell you I can't, by showing that you can. So ask yourself, who's my greatest competition? How can I conquer him? That's your journal prompt. Let me send you on your way with just a couple of things. Number one, if you're enjoying this podcast and you'd like to continue enjoying it, do me a favor and pick up a copy of my book, In Valor 365, Stoic Meditations for First Responders. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, anywhere you get your books. It's on Kindle, it's on Nook if you prefer to get your books that way, or you can get the paperback edition, which you can take notes in and highlight. It's a great way to practice this philosophy daily. It's going to give you quotes, contextualization that's directly relatable to your job, and daily journal prompts and action items that can help you integrate these lessons. And it is the greatest way to support this podcast because all the sales of that book keep the doors open here so I can continue to give you this free podcast that hopefully gives you some tips, tools, and tactics to gain greater resilience so you can attack your job and the world with greater virtue. If you want to support this podcast, you can also go over to thestoicresponder.substack.com where you can sign up for free to get this podcast in your email box 4 times a week. On that page, you can get the podcast delivered to your email. You'll also get any weekly newsletters that I write. I haven't written one in a little bit because I've been a little bit busy, but when I write those newsletters, you'll get that too if you sign up over there. And finally, please like, share, and subscribe to this podcast so that others can hear about this philosophy and get something out of it as well. So with that being said, it's Friday. Get out there, live your lives with valor, enjoy your weekend, and until Tuesday, you are out of roll. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, like, rate, and share this podcast so that we can spread the benefits of Stoicism to other first responders. It will only take you a few moments, but it can help us tremendously. Until next time, out of roll.